Welcome everybody to our SnapPlus version 3 webinar. This is the 6th of our summer webinar series, and today we're focused on grazing. So my name is Hava Blair. I'll be the main presenter today, and then we will be joined a little bit later by Matt Bolin from UW Extension Crop and Soils team, and he will have some tips to share about aspects of version 3 that he finds helpful, especially when you're working with grazing in the nutrient management plan. So the main focus of today will be grazing features, but along the way, I will point out some key elements if you're just joining for the first time on this grazing webinar and have not been present for the previous ones. I will just point out a few things along the way that you might want to look into from our previous webinars to help understand a lot of the more basic features that were covered earlier on. So today I have an example set up. We're starting on the home screen. I'm logged into my SnapPlus version 3 account, and we'll be going to my grazing webinar example, which is the plan that I have set up for our example today. And the first thing that I want to talk about is what crops do we currently have available for grazing in SnapPlus, and then what's coming in the future. And to do that, I'll stick here on the farm page and go to the crop selection tab, where I have selected a variety of pasture crops that can be used in grazing and nutrient management plan. And then I'll use the search bar at the top of the crop selector to start typing the word pasture, and that will bring up some additional options that I have not yet selected. So big picture right now in SnapPlus version 3, we have the 3 perennial pasture options that are part of the UW nutrient recommendations in the A2809 document. So those would be pasture grass legume mix, and then a pasture that has more than 30% legumes in that mix. So we're talking about cool season perennials here. SnapPlus also has other crops, annual crops, warm season annuals that you could graze. Most of today's presentation is focused on people who are using these cool season pastures, these perennial pastures. And at the end, I'll talk about some features that are coming to incorporate things like grazing on corn stalks, grazing of maybe annual silages and forages and stuff like that. So today is primarily focused on these crops that have this word pasture in the label. And you can see we have a number of different options here that reflect not only the type of pasture you have, whether it's just grass or a grass legume, but you also want to pay attention to the fact that we have seeding years. So we have versions of these crops that incorporate the seeding. And then we also have versions of the crop that incorporate hay cuts. So you'll see how this all fits together when we visit the management page. But to start out with, I just want to make you aware that here on the crop selection page, this is a good place to start to make sure that you are actually selecting anything that you want to use over on the management page. So if you would like to pick one of these options that includes a small grain nurse crop that might be planted as your first establishing a pasture, those are distinct options too that you would want to pick from this list. So good place to start. Make sure you have the crops that you need. We'll skip over some stuff, but I want to take a brief moment to talk about soil tests. So soil tests are important in a nutrient management plan generally, and also for pastures. So we get to our soil tests by going to the fields page and the soil test tab. I have already uploaded soil tests today, but I wanted to take a brief detour here just as a reminder that if you're starting a nutrient management plan for the first time, just getting in here, a really good early step before you go and start, planting crops on your fields is to get your soil tests imported. We have the ability to import spreadsheets. So as long as you're getting your soils tested at a DATCAP certified lab, they will be able to give you a CSV, that's the format of the spreadsheet, and then you can use this import soil tests button here to import that data in. So getting soil tests is a very important part of making sure that SnapPlus can give you good nutrient recommendations based on your specific soils. So UW has some nice existing resources that talk about soil sampling strategies, and in particular soil sampling strategies on pastures that we will put in the chat. So there's some different considerations on pastures relative to our sort of annual cropping fields when you think about soil sampling, how to set that up. And I will make sure that we get in the chat during the presentation today that information for you to look at. So soil tests happen here. I've already got mine loaded in. And then I also want to take a brief detour and talk about maps. So for the most part, I have our pastures that we're using today drawn on the map. If we go to the Maps tab, we can see the outlines here of my boundaries. So I've drawn these in, but I have one pasture that I have not yet drawn, just so I can do a quick demonstration for you of how to add a pasture to your plan. So if I go to the Edit tab here and click on Field, I can add a new one and use my cursor to draw the outline here. So I'll go through and draw the outline of my pasture. And exactly how you set this up, splitting up pastures and paddocks, there's a lot of different ways you could do that. I'm just going to do one big area right now. And then I have a field set up called West. Here I'm seeing information about the boundary acres, which is just very simply how many acres are in this shape that I just drew. That's a good reality check. If you have some idea approximately how many acres you're expecting, this is just a way to help you know that you got it about right with your drawing. When I click Save, my field boundary will save, and now it's labeled with West, which is the name of this pasture. All right, we have our soil tests, we have our pastures drawn on the map. That step of getting them drawn on the map is important because that helps populate all this information about the soils and the slope and other key details, again, that SnapPlus is going to use to give you nutrient recommendations for these pastures. So if I visit the Land Attributes tab now, I can see that I have these 5 different pastures that are available on my farm, and I can see that I have soil information populated for all of these. That's going to help SnapPlus know how to give nutrient recommendations on the management page. So now a good place to start, we have our pastures. We are going to add some crops. So I'll go to my example that I just made here. And actually, I think I want to be on East. And I'm going to get rid of what I have here and show you an example of how to start from scratch. So the first time that you come to the management page, if you don't already have crops planned, we need to add crops to the field. We're starting on the field view here, and I want to go through a couple different examples that are specific to adding these perennial pasture crops. So these are questions that we see come up a lot, and I just wanted to walk through what that looks like. So at a very basic level, we need to start by selecting the relevant year. Here I'm selecting calendar year, and then the plant season is what we have to select next before we can start picking crops. We are imagining on this East 2 field or East 2 pasture that I'm working on, we're imagining that in 2024, I am establishing this pasture. So I'm going to select, and it's a spring seeding. So I'm going to select this April, May plant season. And then I can go to my crop dropdown here and select this and see all of the options for different crops that I have available to me in the April, May plant season. So in my case, I'm going to select the pasture grass legume seeding, and then I select a yield and a tillage. So this would be the tillage that was used to prepare the pasture before this seeding. So I'll say, let's spring chisel no disc. SnapPlus has saved this row, and I can now add future years after I've seeded this pasture. So if I go and I click the new crop button, then I have a row that's added in 2025, and now I'm ready to pick established pasture grass legume. And one thing I want you to notice is that now as I'm selecting these different options, I actually have an additional required piece of information on this established pasture, and that is the grazing management. So I have 2 options here, rotational and continuous. And we're going to take a brief detour to the SnapPlus wiki page so I can show you where we have the definitions of these things and help you understand how to pick one. So if you haven't yet been on our new help pages, our SnapPlus V3 help pages are on a wiki, and I have pulled up here the grazing page, which you can find by going to the sidebar and clicking on nutrients. And then here on the nutrients page, I have all these different options for different tabs, and I will click on grazing. So some of the stuff that I'm covering today, if you need a reminder and don't want to take the time to watch this video recording, what you can do is come to the wiki page and find a lot of this basic information and definitions. So I'm going to go down to the grazing management definitions on this page and point out that here is where you can read about what we mean by the rotational and continuous options that were in that drop-down menu. In this case, we would want to select rotational when we have a managed pasture and grazing events are not exceeding 7 days, which they will allow for a rest period for adequate regrowth of the pasture. So that's that rotational management. You're having that rotational management for the pastures when you select that option. If this does not fit what's happening, if instead the animals have sort of unrestricted access to the pasture without those rest periods and without those shorter grazing events, then you'll want to pick the continuous option. And the reason why we make you select this here is that this changes what's happening behind the scenes when we calculate soil loss and when we are estimating how much disturbance, how much ground cover can be expected on a pasture, given the crop and the yield that you have, and also given this type of management. So in my case, I'll select rotational. And then when you're selecting yields, an important reminder for pastures and in general is that for pastures, these are dry matter yields. So in general, in SnapPlus, when you are picking a yield out of this yield dropdown, if you ever need to know, like, what's the moisture content, like, okay, I see the yield units, but what is the moisture content? How do I know that pastures are a dry matter yield? We get all of that from the UW nutrient recommendations. I'm showing the PDF here. This would be the A2809 nutrient recommendations. And table 4.2 has all these different crops that Wisconsin has nutrient recommendations for, including a yield range and a reporting moisture content. So what I was just saying is that when we're working with our pasture crops, which are down here in the middle, these are all reported on a dry matter or DM basis for the yield. So I bring that up because if any of you are working on grazing plans, if you're doing things like carrying capacity calculations, in those cases, you're always thinking about dry matter yields when you're trying to figure out, like, do I have enough forage? How much forage do I need? And I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that SnapPlus follows along with that in reporting these dry matter yields. So I'll go through and select my yield, and then since this is an established pasture, my tillage is none. Let's say that now that I have this pasture established, I'm planning to keep it in pasture for many years. I've got my fences, I've got my water, this is going to be a pasture. I can save myself some time by using this duplicate crop button to add additional years into the future. So when I click duplicate crop once, I get a row that's added in 2026, and it is an exact copy of that row that I had highlighted in 2025. So I can click that a couple times. Let's plan this out into the future a little bit. And now I have from 2024 to 2028, I have pasture crops represented on this field. The next thing that I'll do now that I have some crops here is I can set my rotation. So I'll start in 2024 and I'll make it a length 5. So I expect this to be a pasture and continue being a pasture. That's a good way to set the rotation. Now I want to go to another field and talk about setting up some of the hay cut options and what those mean. So let's head to the north field and make some changes on this field. So here I still have that pasture grass legume crop, but let's say in 2026, I plan not just to graze this pasture, but I'm also going to take some hay cuts early in the season. If I'm doing that, I want to make sure to select the pasture crop option that includes hay cuts here. And the reason that's important, again, is that it changes behind the scenes our assumptions about how much biomass you're removing from that field and helps us make sure that we're making appropriate assumptions when it comes to estimating soil loss. So if I'm taking hay, I would want to pick a hay cut option. And then you'll see that I have similar options when it comes to the grazing management, but they incorporate the hay cuts, recognizing that both of these things are happening. I'm rotational grazing, but then I'm also taking one or multiple hay cuts from this pasture. I would want to adjust my yield accordingly. So often we would expect that if you're taking hay, you might be taking some cuts early. You might have a slightly higher yield coming off of that pasture. You can make the appropriate choice here in the yield menu. So any place that we're taking hay cuts, we would want to just make sure we update that to reflect our management. So once you go through and have your pasture crops planned on all of your different pastures, that is a good time to go through and start thinking about setting up your grazing schedule. So this is a brand new thing for SnapPlus version 3. We have a new feature called the Grazing tab, and it's on the nutrients page. So this combines elements of the grazing estimator that was in SnapPlus version 2 that helped you estimate how much manure, like what is the rate of manure that you should add for a grazing application. We're combining that with the ability to build a herd representing your grazing animals into one thing, and that's the grazing schedule. So when we come to the grazing tab, I don't have anything set up yet. So I'm kind of starting from scratch in this example. If I'm ready to make a grazing schedule, what I can do is click on this gear button, which is my grazing schedule settings, and create a new grazing schedule. So I will call this my example schedule. And once I'm done with the name, I can click the check button to save it. Once I've saved it, I see a bunch more information on my screen. So now we're looking at sort of a calendar interface, and we're always looking at one crop year at a time. So if I go to this crop year selector, the drop-down menu shows me different crop years that are available on my plan, and I can select the one that I'm interested in from the menu. The other information that I see here is that this schedule is not currently applied to any fields in 2026. And I also don't have any animals planned here. So that's going to be my next step. Thinking just about the 2026 crop year, when you're building a grazing schedule, what you want to do is think about grazing schedules in terms of groups of pastures that you manage in a similar way. So I'm going to start with just one grazing schedule here so that you get the idea of how to add animals. And then we'll add a little bit more complexity with some examples of cases where you might want to create a separate schedule, maybe for a different group of pastures that you're doing some stockpile grazing. So let's start with a basic example of I have some animals that are grazing from May through October, kind of the main grazing season. I want to represent those with this grazing schedule. I can click the Add Animals button here, and then I have access to a number of controls that allow me to put animals on my calendar. So you're basically putting your grazing animals that are grazing together across a group of pastures on this schedule. I'm going to use a little shortcut in the month menu to say May through October. And then let's imagine that I have some heifers going out, and I'll select the animal type or animal group here from the drop down. I can type in a number of animals here into this box that says number of animals, and then I also can pick the time that they spend on pasture. So for now, let's keep it easy and just say 100%. When I finished making those selections, those animals are added to my calendar and I can see them here May through October. Let's just keep that as the most basic element of a grazing schedule. So two important things to know about the way that SnapPlus thinks about grazing here. May through October is defined as like the main grazing season. So that's when we're expecting that most of your perennial forages are actively growing. You might be out there grazing. That's the May through October period. Also on this schedule, we have November through April. And remember, SnapPlus is always thinking in crop years. So we're not looking at the 2026 calendar year here. We're looking at fall to fall, the 2026 crop year. So that includes periods of time where your perennial pastures are dormant, they're not growing, but you might still have animals out on some pastures during this time if you're doing any stockpile grazing during a dormant season, or if you have animals out on a pasture for overwintering and you're bale grazing, they might still be out there depositing manure on a given pasture or set of pastures, and you'd want to capture that in terms of nutrient management. So we're showing you all the different months here, and it's just important to pay attention to what crop year you're in, and then looking at these specific months to make sure that you get the animals in the right place here. All right. Couple more things I want to show you before we move on to actually using this grazing schedule. I added all of my animals using the controls at the top, but if let's say that I made a mistake, like it's not 30 dairy heifers, maybe it's 40. I have a couple different ways that I can make that change. I have the ability to edit a specific month by clicking on different aspects of that month. So I can click on the number 30 here under May 2026, and then I can enter a new number. So I can fix it and I can type 40 there, and that will update just the value in May 2026. Let's say, though, what I want to do is actually update the number for all of these months. So June through October, I actually meant to type 40 dairy heifers. What I can do is use this configure animals option at the top, and this is just like a quick edit option. So I can say, okay, I'm interested in editing all of the lines that are these 30 dairy heifers. And what I want to do is actually update that number to 40 and then do that across the board. So if you notice now what has happened, I have the number 40 for all of these months where it used to be 30. So you can do that for any of these different types of information that are available in the month. So I could have changed the animal type. I could have changed the percentage of time that the animal was on the pasture. That's just a very sort of a convenience option if you're trying to edit multiple months at once and you want to save yourself a few clicks from having to go through and do it one by one. Another thing that you can do here is, let's say that I had intended to have animals on in April. I can also drag and drop to copy. So if I want to just keep exactly what was present here in July 2026 and drag that and copy it up to April, all I did was click on that row and then drag it up there, and that was copied to the April month. If I just want to get rid of something, I can do that by clicking on this trash can for the delete button. So you can use these controls to help refine how many animals are present for this crop year in this specific grazing schedule. I'm going to take a quick pause, and I think I may have seen something come up in the chat for a question. So just give me a moment. Nothing in the chat. Okay, so far so good. Next, I want to show you what it looks like to actually apply this grazing schedule. So we have our pasture crops set up on our fields, our soil tests are loaded in, and now I have a preliminary idea of the grazing animals that I have present in the main part of the grazing season. When I'm satisfied with this, my next step is to click Apply Grazing Schedule, and then I get this pop-up. And this is showing me all of the fields where I currently have pastures available for grazing. And what I can do is select all of the ones where I want those animals to graze. So let's say that with that grazing schedule I built, the animals are going to be moving across these 4 pastures during crop year 2026. I clicked on them to select them, and then once I'm ready, I can click Submit. And what SnapPlus does now is a few calculations behind the scenes. This is one way that we're trying to make the process of adding manure deposited by grazing animals easier compared to SnapPlus version 2. So what just happened when I clicked apply is that SnapPlus looked at the number and type of animals, looked at how many days those animals are present, accounted for the percentage of time the animals were grazing, and it came up with a number. How much manure is that? We can figure out, based on the number of animals and the time that they're present, a quantity of manure. How many tons of manure are we working with? And then the next step was SnapPlus looked at those 4 pastures that I selected off of the list and said, how many acres do we have for grazing? For this specific schedule and this group of animals, how many acres are available that we can imagine this manure is getting deposited across those acres? So using those 2 pieces of information, SnapPlus calculates the total acres applied. So that would be the total acres for those 4 pastures. And then we can also calculate how many animal units based on these animals do we have per acre, just as a kind of a helpful metric to help you understand where you're at for this group of animals in the grazing season and the non-grazing season. We do those calculations separately because there are some specific rules around soil testing on pasture that rely on grazing and non-grazing season numbers. So you're going to see those separately here. Because I only have animals present in May through October, the number I'm seeing here in the upper right-hand corner for grazing season animal units per acre is populated, but I still see a 0 for the non-grazing season. So I've applied this grazing schedule. Let's go take a look in 2026, what that actually looks like on the field itself. So I can go back to the management page and the field view, and then highlight one of my 2026 rows by clicking on it. And then if I open nutrient applications here in the upper right-hand corner, now you can see that SnapPlus has added a grazing application to this pasture. So I have my example schedule. That was the name of my schedule that I made. The application season is the grazing season, which is that May through October period. The method is grazing or gleaning. So these animals are depositing the manure for you. And then we have a rate that was calculated using that same method I was describing, where SnapPlus assumes even average across all of those pastures that you selected. So this is why it's important when you're building your grazing schedules to be thinking in terms of groups of pastures that are managed in a similar way. If it's not reasonable to assume that the animals are sort of spending about an equal amount of time on those four pastures, that would be an opportunity to make a different grazing schedule or have multiple grazing schedules so that you can, approximately represent what would be reasonable in terms of the amount of time that the animals are spending on these different pastures. So for the four pastures that I selected and applied that schedule, each of them is going to have this 3.2 tons per acre application. So if I go visit my south pasture and look in 2026, here I can see that I have my grazing manure application, again, 3.2 tons per acre. And then I also happen to have a potash application that was already planned on this field. I have a reminder here below the soil test information, again, just for grazing applications, for any grazing that's happening on this pasture, a reminder of what my animal units per acre value is in the grazing season and the non-grazing season. All right. I have one more thing that I want to show you back on the grazing schedule, and then we will take a brief pause, and I'm going to pass the mic over to Matt from UW Extension, and he'll share a little bit more information about ways to use this management page when you're thinking about grazing management. So my tip that I forgot to share that I want to go back and make sure I share with you is back on the grazing tab, and I showed you how to enter animals in 2026, and I showed you different ways to do that, different ways to change that. Another point that I wanted to make is that if we put ourselves a year in the future and think to 2027, we can we can update or change the grazing schedule in 2027. So the data is saved by crop year. If you generally have a similar herd size from year to year with minor changes, one really quick way to populate your data for the next year is to use this copy prior year button, which I just clicked, which is below your grazing schedule selector. All that does is looks at 2026 and it copies over all of those animals into 2027, potentially saving me some time if all I need to do is make some minor tweaks to animal numbers or things like that. So that's another kind of quick way to make an edit here to the grazing schedule. All right, I will stop sharing my screen and pass things off to Matt, who will talk to us a little bit more about what's going on the management page.
Thank you. Hava, do you want me to jump into it right away, or did you say you wanted to take a tiny break?
I don't see any questions, so why don't you go ahead and we'll keep rolling.
Perfect. So let me share my screen here. How are we looking? Can you see version 3?
Yes, yes, sir.
Perfect. Alrighty. Well, like Hava mentioned earlier, my name is Matt Bolin. I'm with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. I am a nutrient management outreach specialist for the Northwest region. I get to work with quite a few grazers in SnapPlus. And so I've got a tip for you here today. But before I hop into that, I'm going to kind of set the stage for it. So, like Hava showed, we already use the grazing feature on this field. And so we have manure applied through that already. And we see that through this nutrient applications right here. I can see I've got my manure in there. So my tip throughout my little brief time to talk right here is on managing phosphorus and potassium in the rotation. I want to first look at like on a year-to-year basis. And so if I look right here in this top corner of the nutrient applications tab, I can see my UW recommendations for my nutrients. In this particular case, I can see my nitrogen recommendation is 0, and that is probably in this case picked up from having a legume on there. We're going to assume our legume is giving enough nitrogen for it. So we're going to be focusing just on this potassium and then our phosphorus. The UW rec that we see right here is 75 and 210. Where are we getting these recommendations? The University of Wisconsin, A2809, the same document that Hava showed earlier, recommends our fertilizer applications based on a soil test category. What that is going to do is that's going to look at our soil type and it's going to look at our soil test. And depending on where that is where these recommendations come from. As an example, I can see right here below this tab where my soil test is at. In this case, I happen to know that this is a loamy field. And so for our phosphorus, we are sitting at 12 part per million right now. So I know, and I'll get into it in just a second, but our category is going to be a little bit low. If we're in the low and the very low categories based on our soil test, what UW is going to recommend is it's going to recommend additional fertilizer to build up our soil test value. And it's going to add a little bit extra every year for about 4 to 8 years until we hit our optimum level. It's going to do the same thing for potassium. If we're at optimum, what the recommendations are going to be is based just purely on crop removal. It's just going to be maintenance applications to maintain our optimum level soil tests. Now, if we're above those, we're in either high or excessively high categories. If we're high, we're going to rely on our soil to supply the bulk of the nutrients. We're still going to have some extra applications to get us through. But the goal of that being that we're going to slowly reduce our soil test value until we hit that optimum range. If we're in excessively high, for pastures in particular, the application rate is just going to be zero to give us enough time to draw down those nutrients until we hit the optimum level. So for this particular case, with my soil test at 12 part per million for phosphorus, and I'm on a loamy soil, like I said, the optimum range is going to be anywhere from 16 to 20 part per million. So I'm definitely low on that. And for potassium, what it would be anywhere from 101 to 130. So I'm also low on my potassium. If I want to look at my rotation, and this is where my tip comes into play, I'm going to come over here to this field details. And when I click on that, I'll go quickly through these, but we're really going to focus on these bottom two. I can look at my acres, tells me the acres, manure spreadable, winter spreadable acres. For fertility, it tells me my predominant soil type, and it tells me my soil group, which is loamy, which is how I was able to come up with what my optimum ranges would be. And then for conservation, it's just going to tell me my critical soil, my slope percent, and then the slope length. But now what I'm going to get into is this P management in rotation. So this over here, I can click through year by year, but that's only going to be on a year by year basis. On the left-hand side, down here in this management in rotation, that is over the set course rotation I have. In this particular case, I have a 3-year rotation. In this 3-year rotation, with just manure applied to this particular pasture, I have added 36 pounds per acre of P2O5. But the crop removal for this is 135 pounds per acre of P2O5. So I have a negative balance in this of 99 pounds per acre. Now, once we're low, we are probably going to start to see the crop not be able to forage quite as much. But for P2O5 in particular, for every 18 pounds of it we have that we add or remove, we're going to change 1 part per million on our soil test. So in this case, assuming the crop could scavenge and remove everything that it needs to at this low soil test range, when we would soil test at the end of this rotation, we would be losing 5.5 part per million in our soil test. I would take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, but what we know is that we're going to be removing more phosphorus out of our soil. We're not going to be maintaining, and we're certainly not going to be adding. We're going to be losing phosphorus the next time we take soil tests. If we look at potassium, it's kind of the same thing. We see we added 48 pounds purely from manure. The crop removal was higher on this one, which is 540 pounds per acre of K2O. And so our balance is a negative 492. Once again, if we assume that the crop could scavenge all of those nutrients, this would be a huge reduction. For potassium, it's 6 to 7 pounds of K2O, whether we add or subtract, is going to change our soil test 1 part per million. So if we assume that number and assume the crop can remove it all at negative 492, we would see a 75.7 part per million reduction in our soil test. We're going to be losing almost 90% of it. Once again, odds are that we're not going to see that huge of a reduction, but we might see some of our yield goals go down or forage production be going down. So what we want to do is we want to be looking at these two, and this is my hot tip, is after we get everything added in here, we want to look at our phosphorus management in rotation and potassium management in rotation. And if we're low like this, we probably don't want to be quite as low in the course of this rotation. Fertilizer is really expensive right now. I fully realize that. Um, but what we would want to do then to maintain forage production is we probably want to be closer to zero in this case. In an ideal world, we would want to add a little bit till we get to the optimum. But this is how we can look at what is happening with our phosphorus and our potassium in the course of our rotation. In this particular plan, and something I see a fair amount, is we're trying to get the bulk of our nutrients from grazing, from the manure deposited by grazing. In this case, it didn't add up to be quite enough. On your farm, it might be, and this is where it's going to tell you if how you're doing on that management. I'll divert real quick here now to see, once we see that we're in these negatives in this particular case, if we wanted to add some supplemental fertilizer to this, we would go back to the nutrients tab, which is where the grazing tab was in within it, and we would click fertilizers. In this particular farm, on a different field, I already have a potash application. But let's say I'm going to be renovating a field and I want to add some phosphorus. And because I have a legume and I don't need to add the nitrogen, maybe I don't want to be using DAP like I would be on one of my hay fields. I can either add a standard fertilizer, maybe I want to add something with a little bit of nitrogen like MAP, or maybe I just want to add some pure phosphorus. If I'm going to be renovating a pasture, I could add something like TSP. For this case, and what I would caution with this, though, too, on the management side of things, is I would personally rather see you try to change your grazing strategy a little bit, maybe incorporate something like bale grazing to increase the phosphorus in the soil tests. But for potassium, we might need to add a supplemental application. So I already have potash selected as a fertilizer, but this is where you would do it so that I could bring it into the management tab. If I hop back over here, on this field, I'm in 2025 and I need quite a bit of potassium. I would just click right here, this new fertilizer. The source would be the two that I've already selected in there. In this case, I want to add some potash. And let's say I'm going to do it in the fall when I'm done grazing. I'm not working up the field, so it's unincorporated. And then I would put in the rate there. I'm going to put in a rate of 325, which should get me closer um, to being where the UW recs are. And it is. I can see that I'm up to a +4 on this particular year. Once that's in there, let's take a look and see. So over here now, then I can see that throughout the course of the rotation, just by adding that potassium application in 1 year. I added a whole bunch additional, and I'm only down to a -294. Let's say fertilizer was a little bit cheaper in 2025, which I know it's not, um, or it wasn't. But what that can let me do is I can look at the rotation when the fertilizer is at a price that like I can afford or I like the price. Those are the years to try to build up to that optimum level. And if we stay at optimum and the price of fertilizer skyrockets, um, I have a little bit stored up in my soil, which is kind of the purpose of using this one, is just to give yourself a buffer to try to get you to that optimum level, and let you weather the storms of fertilizer prices. So that is my hot tip for you today.
All right, thanks, Matt. That's perfect. And that's a good transition into a few more things that I wanted to share here. So let's see. Couple more thoughts here before I take questions. Right. I think, sorry, I'm having a screen sharing difficulties here. One moment, everybody. All right, we're back in V3. So I wanted to talk through a few more specific examples related to grazing schedules and managing maybe cases where you might want to create multiple grazing schedules for a given operation, and maybe spark some good conversations about what everybody on this call sees in terms of nutrient management plans where there is some grazing happening. Because I know there's a lot of different types of operations out there, and what I'm hoping to do is show you some of the flexibility of what we have set up, and then also get your ideas if you are thinking of situations that we're not yet covering, because I know we're not covering everybody. So let's head back to our grazing, to the nutrients page and the grazing tab, and let's create another schedule. So I walked through how to create this example schedule. Let's say that I want to create another one. I can do that by, again, going to the grazing schedule settings menu, clicking on create new grazing schedule, and then I'm going to call this one stockpile grazing. That is going to be my example here. So we have a schedule that essentially represents our main grazing season here, May through October. And let's imagine that, so we have our 4 pastures that we had selected for this schedule. Those are good to go. Let's imagine that we have another pasture that we're actually planning to use for some stockpile grazing in November and December. So we're planning to let the forage grow on that one so that it can be available in these sort of dormant type seasons where we might still want to try to have animals out on pasture that we can do here. So in this example, I'm imagining that I have a separate pasture or a couple pastures that I want to do this stockpile grazing. And what I can do is set that up as a separate schedule and say, okay, this is really just focusing on November and December as months, because I have a distinct sort of management scenario there. And then I can select my type of animal and my number of animals here and the time that they're spent on pasture. So now I'm only showing November and December. And then once I have this set up, what I could do is go and apply the grazing schedule and then pick whichever pasture is the one that I'm intending to do the stockpile grazing. So maybe it's just one, and I would click submit. And then what SnapPlus would do would be add a manure application that represents this number of animals for this period of time to that pasture that I selected. And again, I can see the information after I took that apply step. I can see that I now have information populated here that says, okay, you have some animals in the non-grazing season, and they're grazing on 22.6 total acres. So that's how I know that I was successful in applying this specific schedule. So you can imagine, depending on the type of operation you're working on, you might have 2 or 3 grazing schedules. It really kind of depends on what your setup is. So I could also create a new schedule if I have if I'm doing some outwintering, maybe I'm doing some bale grazing like Matt was talking about. That might be a different pasture. So that might not be something that is relevant to all of my pastures, but maybe I have one pasture, one area where I know, okay, in 2026, this is where they're spending the winter. And this is again where it becomes important to just pay attention to the crop year that you have selected to make sure that you're getting the animals on there in the right crop year. So if I'm thinking about the November that's coming up here in just a few months, I would need to switch to crop year 2027. So that's crop year 2027. I'm thinking ahead into the future. Maybe I have some animals that are outwintering for this December through early April period. And I would add those to a grazing schedule in crop year 2027. You can go through and make edits to these schedules, like I pointed out, after you've got them set up. So another important thing to think about when it comes to grazing is we can use these grazing schedules to write our plan for the future. And then when you come back and make updates the next winter or whenever you're sitting down to update your nutrient management plan, just like you would update, crop and tillage and fertilizer application information to reflect what actually happened, you want to take the same approach with your grazing schedules. So we can set up our grazing schedules with our sort of best guess about what's going to happen in a given crop year. And then when you come in and make annual updates to your plan, that's your opportunity again to come in here and make any changes so that this reflects what actually happened. So maybe you had to make some sort of game time decisions and move some things around, had different things going on with your pastures. That's all stuff that we can edit here from the grazing schedule. So if it turns out that in 2026, I actually was not using all 4 of these pastures, maybe I only used 3 of them, I can adjust by going in and taking the same steps that we took to initially apply the schedule. So even though this schedule has already been kind of sent out and is being used on those 4 fields, if I need to make an adjustment, I can do that by clicking again on this apply. And that brings up and shows me that these are my 4 pastures that are currently active with this schedule. Let's say that I need to remove this East 1 pasture because there's something else going on. I don't want that to be included with my main group of sort of grazing season pastures. I can make that change and then click submit. And then SnapPlus will make some adjustments so that we see we have our number of acres was adjusted. This value for animal units per acre was adjusted. And then if I go and check out my manure applications on some of these pastures, those will also have changed to reflect the reduction in pasture area and therefore a change in the manure rate that's going on the field. So you can see here now my rate is 4.8. So SnapPlus is doing that math to say, how much manure do we have? How many acres do we have? And it's calculating that spreading rate for what the animals are depositing. I have two more cases that I want to share with you. And one relates to some ongoing development that we're doing, and I have some early designs to share, and I'm interested in questions or information from you about how this would work with your nutrient management plans. And the thing that we get a lot of questions about is, well, what about gleaning corn stalks? So what if I have my animals out on a field in the late fall, early winter, and they're grazing, gleaning on these corn stalks? Right now, the grazing tab in SnapPlus is set up really to handle these perennial pastures that we've been talking about. But we have been working on a way to integrate, grazing of annual forages and some of those gleaning type corn stalk situations so that everything is done from the grazing schedule. So that is coming, that is the vision. And I want to show you what you can do right now, which is August 2026, and then give you a preview of what's coming in the future. So for anybody that's watching this recording in later than August 2026, we will include a link that gives you the update to what the most recent features are, because this is an ongoing area that we're trying to expand and just make it easy to use in one place when you're thinking about grazing. So what should you do now? Let's say I have a field and it has some corn stalks that I would like to reflect, some animals going out and grazing. What would I do right now? And so I have a little workaround that I want to briefly share with you, and then I will pivot and show you the design for what we're working on as it relates to this type of thing. So in this moment, if you're writing your nutrient management plan today and you want to show these animals that are gleaning on the corn stalks, what I'm going to have you do is treat it just like you would another mechanical manure application. And what I mean by that is you're going to go to your nutrients page and your manure tab, and you're actually going to make yourself a manure source called dairy grazing. So in this example, we're imagining some dairy grazing. I'll point out that this was not a step that you needed to take when you were using your grazing schedule. So when you're using this grazing feature that we've built, we behind the scenes are handling, all the assumptions about the manure and the type of animal, and it works. We do the math. The workaround that I'm showing you today does require that you actually add a manure source, and to distinguish it from other manure sources that you might have, like, from the barn or whatever, give it a name like dairy grazing. I picked semi-solid as the type. And then a key part of this, if you're using this workaround, is you need to add a manure analysis value that reflects grazing manure nutrients. And I'll do an example here to show you an important point about how we think about grazing manure nutrients versus a manure that might be stored piled or in a pit, is that they have different nutrient availabilities. So we know that for manure that is being deposited by the animals, we're expecting a different amount of volatilization. We're expecting a different amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium availability just based on the conditions under which it's deposited. So we want to be using these as excreted nutrient values. And we have a table of those for you that is, again, on our wiki page. So if you're needing to use this workaround during this brief period of time, you're going to go back to the wiki page that I showed earlier, and I'll put that in the chat. You're going to look for our grazing manure nutrient values, and you will see a table here that tells you what to do. So if you're using this workaround, this table is your reference point for the information that you can add as a manure analysis for your grazing source. So that's exactly what I've done here. I've updated my as excreted values. And then I have a second step before I'm ready to go. So I have my grazing manure, and then similar to SnapPlus version 2, I need some idea of how much manure I'm working with. So an easy way to do that is to use the livestock tab as a calculator. And we'll use that livestock tab to say, okay, maybe I have, I'll add a row, and let's say that we have our dairy, looking for my heifers here. So I have some heifers. I can enter a number of heifers and then a number of days. So let's say that I only have I'm only gleaning on those corn stalks for like 2 weeks. So that would be 14 days, 20 animals. And I'm going to say 100%, which is this column here, percent deposited as grazing or gleaning, 100% of their manure. I want to know, what is that number? How many tons of manure am I working with if I have 20 animals for 14 days and it's all grazing? We can look at the very end, the final column here, which is the tons per year deposited on pasture, is 8. Okay, so I know the number 8. That's my total amount of manure. So then I would just need to do a little bit of math based on the acres available to me for and say, what is 8 divided by the acres? And that's going to get me my rate for going on the field. So here is my west field. It's about 30 acres. So I'll bring up and I'll say, okay, 8 divided by 30, and that's going to give me my rate of the amount of manure. So I'm going to do some very, very quick mental math. And before I add this application, actually, I want to talk to you about season. So the animals are grazing on the corn stalks. They're probably grazing in the late fall, early winter after the corn is harvested. So a key point is that their manure actually gets credited to the next crop, right? Because the corn is gone. We've harvested the corn. It's not receiving those nutrients. So what we want to do is actually add this application in the 2027 soybeans, which is the crop that comes after the corn. So I'm going to say I have a grazing manure application here. I'm going to say it's in the winter. Of course, it's on the surface. And then here is where I can enter my rate. So I'm just going to say it's 0.2 tons per acre. And that's going to add a grazing manure application that's just a surface application, and it'll get some nutrients on the field. You can see it's a very small rate, just given the total amount of manure that I have and how big this pasture is. But the concept is the same. So that's a workaround for now. I know it's more steps than we want it to be. So now I want to pivot to what are we working on coming soon for a better way to do this. And so for this, I'll share a PowerPoint screen and say thank you to Dan on the SnapPlus team who has been working on this. So this is in development, and I wanted to show it during the webinar today because I suspect that we might have people here who are interested to see it and might even have ideas for what this would look like on some of their plans. So now we can all imagine this is a future feature in SnapPlus, and it is a more, I'll say, detailed way or a more customizable way to apply these grazing schedules. So we've been talking about these grazing schedules that have the months and they have the animals. And so the way that we're looking at setting this up is in that pop-up menu that comes up when you're saying, okay, I'm ready to apply my grazing schedule. We are looking at showing the availability of different forages, different crops that you might be grazing for each pasture. So each row here represents a different field or pasture. And then the crop that's listed in the cell, so if this is a table, we've got our rows, we've got our columns, we see crops that might be available in different months. So here we're looking at what must be some sort of stockpile grazing or obviously some gleaning for the corn. And the idea here is that you would click on each of these to highlight when the animals are present. So in this example, this bluish green color, that means that it's selected. And this grayish color, which we see in March, that means that it's unselected. So this is again where we have to just think carefully about the timing of what's going on here. Field 5 must have been planted in corn grain the previous cropping season. So we harvested the corn grain. There's probably some stalks there. If we want to show gleaning on those stalks in, let's say, November, we would come through here and click to deselect February, January, and December, and just leave November highlighted. And that's us saying, okay, in November, the animals are gleaning on those corn stalks. And it's the same type of idea for this annual ryegrass. If we were doing some kind of stockpile grazing or something like that, we would select only the months that the animals were present on this pasture or on this field doing the grazing. So it's a similar type of calendar interface, but you can imagine if you had more pastures here, so we might see a longer list than just 2 fields. We might also see the perennial pastures and the availability of that forage. this allows you to go through and be more specific for one grazing schedule about the timing of when that group of animals that you've set up is doing the grazing. So this is kind of what we're currently working on, and hope to have that out yet this fall, with some additional tweaks that we're just making to make sure that we get the manure applications right behind the scenes. So this is looking ahead, the recommended way that we recommend you go through and deal with things like the gleaning of corn stalks. So I showed you the workaround way. This is the new way that's coming, that we're kind of working in development. Oh yes, great question from Amy in the chat. I'm going to start calling these out. So Amy says, in V2, we can enter the total amount of manure applied to a field, and Snap will calculate the tons or gallons per acre rate for us. Is this something that can be added to V3? Yes, Amy, that would have been very helpful for that example that I was showing, with the corn. So yes, that is straightforward to add. We could do something for that. And then Josh asks, any suggestions on how to enter a pasture fertilizer application to only a portion of the pasture? Most of the pastures I work with are too steep in many areas to get fertilizer applied. Ooh, in all the areas that the livestock have access to. That is a good question, Josh. And maybe I might follow up with you specifically. One way, so I'm gonna pull up a map and maybe ask some questions, and you can let me know how far off I am here, because I do have an idea based on what you're talking about. So my first question is, are the livestock still grazing on these really steep areas or not? Like, so the livestock have access to maybe the one part of the field, but are they actually still grazing there? Oh, they are. Okay. Okay. Well, then that means that the idea that I had might not totally work for you. So unfortunately, we don't have a good way to show, without making a separate field, we don't really have a good way, which from a topography perspective, I can imagine why that would be not a great option depending on your topography. Unfortunately, we don't have a good way to track partial field applications, I think, in the way that you're describing. So, and this will be a good opportunity for me to kind of show the way that SnapPlus approaches the nutrient accounting, and then might have to follow up with you for best way to think about this, because you have just a fertilizer application on a part of it. Okay, I am going to make up a little example here that I think will work for us. So let's pick one of these. So thinking about nutrient accounting, when we're here on the management page and we're looking at this little table that is showing the recommendations and how much we've applied and the over under, this math that's happening here is always happening for basically the entire what we call spreadable area for a given application. So when we're talking about fertilizer, in most cases, the spreadable area is equal to the cropping acres. So if I've got a potash application that's going on in the fall, it's a surface application. When I put in 100 pounds, SnapPlus says, okay, I'm putting on 100 pounds per acre on 16.5 acres, which in this case is equal to the cropping acres. So that's, then my total amount of potash we could figure out based on the pounds per acre and the planned acres. So SnapPlus is always going to kind of, even if you make a partial field application, like you're saying, it's only going on part of the field, SnapPlus is always going to kind of average that across that whole spreadable area. So let's say that I only put on 100 pounds per acre on half of the field. There's two ways that you could enter this. It's not ideal, but I'll show you the two options. If it's 100 pounds and it only went on, let's say 8.25 acres, which is exactly half of this field, I have two ways that I could show that. One way is to just say I'm applying on half the acres. So it's going to be half the rate because again, SnapPlus is averaging this. So this will result in the total amount of potash, that number being correct. But the rate here is, you were applying at a higher rate on a portion of the field. So we don't really have a great option. We have an option to show the total amount being correct, but as far as the rate, we don't really have a way to do those partial applications within the field. One way that it can, I think, look a little bit better, at least from importing the data from that perspective, is if you treat this like an application record. So if you come in and say, you can do this for fertilizers and you say, I'm on field East 2, I've got a potash application on the surface. Say I did it in November. And then here is where, and you could do this with a spreadsheet, SnapPlus is going to assume that this potash application goes on the cropping area type, which is 16.5 acres. If you only did it on 7 acres, you can say it was only applied to 7 acres, and I applied this rate to the 7 acres. This is nice because this at least reflects kind of the reality that you were doing 100, pounds per acre on 7 acres. And then I want to show you the way that SnapPlus represents this because it's still going to get averaged across that total spreadable area when we go and look at field East 2. So if I go to East 2 in 2026 in the fall, you can see that SnapPlus took that 100 pounds per acre on 7 acres and it averaged it across those 16.5 acres to show an average rate of 42 pounds across the spreadable area. So that's kind of two ways to do it. I know neither is ideal, but unfortunately we don't have a way to show you separate accounting within a given field right now. Okay, glad that helps a little. I know it's not perfect. I know exactly what you're saying, and we have good. Yeah, we'll have to think about this, because we have similar questions, not in relation to fertilizer, but for anybody that's managing manure in the Silurian bedrock part of the state on the east side. You might know that there are rate restrictions for those different Silurian bedrock depth areas. And so you can apply, up to X number of gallons per acre on some of the field, but other parts of the field, you can apply more or apply less. And so that's where this gets tricky for sure. All right, other questions from folks?